Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, as President of the University of Zurich, it's a great pleasure for me to welcome you all to this exciting event this evening. When talking about sustainability, the debate often focuses on ecological aspects. However, sustainability has important social and economical dimensions as well. The depletion of natural resources and the consequences of climate change are confronting our society with risks of massive migration, resource wars, and famine. There is currently growing recognition that, in particular, sustainable finance could become a key driver for sustainable development on a global level. Sustainable finance goes beyond the standard finance approach to risk variance by introducing metrics of impact in order to assess the contribution of portfolios to sustainability and financial stability. The majority of capital, however, is still today not aligned with these objectives. The Finexus Conference 2018 addresses the question of how to close this gap between finance and sustainability, bridging the academic research, finance industry, and policy. Sustainable finance is a well-established discipline and an important field of research at our university. At the UZH Department of Banking and Finance, there are currently several research centers that focus on sustainable investment practices. First and foremost, the Finexus Center for Financial Networks and Sustainability addresses research and policy questions about sustainable finance by using network data and network models. The Center for Sustainable Finance and Private Wealth focuses on sustainable finance and on private investment practices, for example, of high net worth individuals or family offices. And finally, the Center for Corporate Responsibility and Sustainability, an associated institute of UZH, explores the role of the private sector in sustainable development. The director of the UZH Finances Center, Professor Stefano Battiston, present today, is at the same time coordinator of the Horizon 2020 research project on distributed financial systems for society. Short name for this project is Dolphins, another nice sustainable name. The Finexus Conference 2018 coincides with the conclusive events of Dolphins, which was in fact the first H2020 project to be led by a Swiss university. The project investigated how finance can be channeled towards sustainable economy within a networked economy. The scientific approach of Dolphins builds on the insights of the economic theory of markets with asymmetric information, a theory for which Professor Joseph Stiglitz was awarded the Nobel Prize in 2001, together with George Akerlof and Michael Spence. We have the great pleasure, I would say the privilege even, of welcoming Joseph Stiglitz as our guest of honor tonight. It is already the third consecutive time that he honors us by speaking to us. So either he likes us or he thinks that we haven't gotten quite it yet. Professor Stiglitz does not need much introduction. Let me just very briefly mention that he is currently professor at Columbia University, and he is, of course, renowned for his fundamental contributions to economic theory. What is more, he has lately been very active in the policy debate on climate change as well, and as you will all see tonight, he's an extremely cogent and entertaining actor in any logical discourse on economy and society. Personally, I am convinced that collaborations between scholars and practitioners have huge potential to promote innovation. Basic research is essential for innovation since it promotes conceptual thinking and has the necessary freedom to explore different methods and solutions. But the private sector plays an essential role too, especially when it comes to transforming our economy into a more sustainable system. Already today, the private sector is gradually reshaping our economy by developing ways of doing business in a more sustainable manner. I am thus particularly happy to welcome our four panelists who represent a mix of the public and the private sector. I extend a warm welcome to Graham Maxton, Secretary General of the Club of Rome, a leading international think tank founded in 1968. The Club of Rome played an important part in the debate on sustainability during the past 50 years. And although it's called the Club of Rome, it is now based in Winterthur, so you're almost a local. Great welcome to Mafalda Duarte, head of the Climate Investment Fund, the CIF, from Washington, D.C. Thanks for having taken the time to fly over. Great welcome to Christopher Steen, global head of lending at ING Wholesale Banking, based in Amsterdam. And a warm welcome to Urban Angern, Group Chief Investment Officer at the Zurich Insurance. Information would be wrong, but Zurich Insurance Group. Let me end by also acknowledging the sources of funding which have made the Finexus conference possible. First, my gratitude to the EU Commission, which has contributed to this conference by funding important research projects like Dolphins, and also the Institute of New Economic Thinking, an organization which is committed to promoting innovative economic theories addressing societal issues. And finally, but definitely not least, many thanks to Professor Stefano Battiston and Professor Marc Chenet and their team for organizing this great event. I'm looking forward to interesting discussions, and I'm hoping for a strong and sustainable growth of my knowledge about sustainable finance. Thank you very much.
Welcome, everybody. I'm really pleased to see full aula yet again. So let me start with explaining in 2 words the theme of the Finexus conference of this year, closing gaps between finance and sustainability. So what is the gap that we're talking about? Well, if you look at statistics about assets under management in different industries, and you look at the union of the labels that you see around, including ESG, SRI, green bonds, and climate bonds, impact investing. In many cases, it amounts up to 50% of assets under management in Europe. That sounds as a lovely and awesome news, and yet, when we look around us, and when we look at other statistics, in particular those that indicate that we are heading towards a 4 degrees global warming pathway, and if we look at the rate of circularity of the economy, that roughly speaking means the amount of recycling that we are able to perform, that's which in Europe is less than 10% and global is less than 5%, that clearly there is a disconnect that emerges. On the one hand, it looks all finance is mostly, almost done with sustainability. On the other hand, it looks like there is still a lot of ground to cover. So, but I need to spend 2 words of why do we have, or what a center on financial networks may have to say about this. So, what finance is, if you really look into what is the easiest or the most simplified definition of finance, is a set of technologies that allow to shift purchasing power, let's say, among people and across time. And as all technologies, it can be used in many different ways. What matters, however, is how purchasing power flows from one part to the next. And in particular, as we know, investing requires many times long chains. So I invest my money in an instrument, But then these instruments, when I open the box and I unpack what is inside, well, it's actually in another investment in per se. And then these are then eventually shares or bonds or a loan to a company, and then I have to unpack the company and see what the company really does. And the company has supply chains that matters for the impact that the economic activity of this company may have on society and the environment. So by talking and by describing this to you, I have mentioned chains of investments and chains of supply. And however, because business is becoming increasingly more complex, all these chains get crossed many times. And when you cross chains, well, that's essentially a basic definition of a network, where you have to look at the structure and you have to look at the actual position of nodes in a graph. And so this is why network data and network models are essential to assess what is the impact that finance can make to the environment and to society, and what is the exposure, on the other hand, that financial portfolios may bear towards risks that sometimes are not, or oftentimes nowadays, they're not encapsulated into the standard metrics of risk, and climate risk is certainly one of those. My name is Stefano Battiston. I'm professor at the Department of Banking and Finance at the University of Zurich. I have the pleasure and the privilege, but also the responsibility tonight to moderate an impressive panel that has been previously mentioned by our president. I have with me representatives of the academia, Joseph Stiglitz from Columbia University, doesn't need introduction, and as Michael said, he has been visiting us now for the third time. Hopefully this time we will get it. Huh? Graham Maxton is playing a leading role in this discussion about sustainability and the boundaries of the planet. And then, however, we also have representatives of the public financial sector, and that's Ms. Duarte, and the private financial sector from Mr. Anger and Mr. Steen. So I'd like to start with the challenging a narrative. I'd like to start by, thank you for signaling that I have to speak closer to the micro, to challenging an ongoing narrative. Usually, climate change is perceived and is described in terms of an economic cost and a risk for the financial system. So I was giving recently interviews, and in the end of a long discussion, the question came, so, well, this is just a cost and someone has to pay, isn't it? And so, is it really so? There are, in fact, actually arguments to challenge this view, and one that I'll try to make, it's very simplified, but if you think about digging a barrel of oil out of the ground implies that the next barrel of oil that you're digging will be more costly than the previous one, and the next reservoir of oil that you're going to discover and exploit is going to be more expensive per unit than the previous one. While, on the contrary, once you have built enough renewable energy infrastructure, the next kilowatt of energy that you will produce, it's at zero cost in terms of marginal terms. So, is it really so that doing things better and cleaner is necessarily more costly and more painful? So this is why I would like to start turning the first question to Graham Maxton. He has, well, first of all, I would like to, the first question to you is actually, if you could give an example of this disconnect between the current way in which the economy is run and our knowledge about the limits and the necessity of sustainability.
Okay, thank you, Stefano. When the Limits to Growth was published in 1972, we warned that there were limits which humanity should not pass, that we shouldn't increase the population, we shouldn't increase our resource use to such an extent that we would cause an ecological crisis. Now, people didn't listen to what we said in 1972, and so today we live in something called overshoot. Now, a lot of positive things have come out of that book. So we have the SDGs today. We have Xi Jinping talking about an ecological civilization. We have carbon pricing. We have the Institute for New Economic Thinking. We've got stranded assets as people get out of coal, oil, and gas. So we've seen a lot of positive things happening. But if I reflect on the last 50 years, the Club of Rome's failed. Because the situation that we're in today is so much worse than it could have been if people had listened to us in 1972. The average sea temperature is higher than it's ever been. The amount of carbon dioxide being pumped into the atmosphere is higher than it's ever been. The amount of methane going into the atmosphere is higher than it's ever been. Inequality is at record levels. Unemployment in many countries is at record levels. And all of this is because we have this obsession with economic growth. Now, the Club of Rome is not against economic growth. What we're against is the growth in the ecological footprint that comes with that. And that's what we have to change. And so we have this disconnect between a sense that we're achieving something, a sense that we're pricing carbon, the sense that we're waking up to the threat of climate change. And I'll talk more about climate change, I hope, in a minute, because climate change really is an existential crisis which we have to deal with very quickly. And yet, we're heading faster in the wrong direction. So I think that's the major disconnect, that people don't really understand how urgent the situation is and how quickly it's coming upon us and how big the change is that we've got to make.
In your recent book that you wrote with Renders, you made 13 feasible proposals, and one of those to address climate change. And one of those is about green growth. Could you elaborate on the precise definition that you're giving there?
I mean, there are lots of definitions of green growth. The one we've chosen is perhaps the strictest version. That today we live as if we have 1.7 planets. People in America live as if they have 5 planets. People in Europe live as if they have 3 planets. But overall, we live as if we had 1.7 planet Earth. So we need to reduce our ecological footprint. Now, when we define green growth, we define that as any investment which reduces the ecological footprint. So if you have 2 paper mills which are producing lots of pollution, and you knock those down and you build 1 paper mill which produces less pollution, that's green growth. If you knock down a coal-fired power plant and you put instead a gas-fired power plant, that's green growth because you're reducing the ecological footprint. If you choose to build a gas plant instead of a coal plant, that's not green growth because you're increasing the ecological footprint. So our definition is whatever you do that reduces the ecological footprint is green growth.
Thank you. And then the next natural question becomes, what are the conditions to set the economy on this pathway?
I mean, when I speak around the world, people often say it's technology. We need to invent something. We need to find some technological solution to the problems. We don't need any technology at all. The problem that we face today is a political problem. It's a question of will. That if our politicians can get together and make a decision to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide we pump into the atmosphere, we can fix this problem. We simply have to pay a little bit more for our electricity and a little bit more for all the goods and services that we use, and we can solve the problem. So it's a political problem. It's a question of us deciding as a society to fix the problem that we're facing. There's nothing beyond that.
Let me turn to Joe. Maybe, Graham, if you could share the micro. So could you comment on the analysis that Graham just made on green growth? So to what extent is green growth meant as a also win-win solution possible, theoretically, and what are the conditions to set the economy on that pathway, in your view?
Yeah, so first let me say I agree very strongly with what Graham said, and I co-chaired with Nick Stern what's called a high-level commission on carbon prices. And our objective was we brought together a group of economists and asked the question on the basis of the research that was available at this point. At what price of carbon could we achieve the kinds of goals that have been set out in Paris? So what price, if we increase the price of carbon, that would induce people to change their behavior? It's not the social cost of carbon. It's asking just a behavioral question. At what price of carbon would induce people to change their behavior to get to those goals? And the result was that the price was not that high. And yes, there's a price. There's nothing free in life. But maybe I'll just read from our conclusion. We said that countries may choose. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, holding everything at one time. Countries may choose different instruments to implement their climate policies depending on national and local circumstances and on the support they receive. Based on an industry and policy experience and the literature reviewed, the Commission concludes that the explicit carbon price level consistent with achieving the Paris temperature target is somewhere between $40 and $80 a ton CO2 by 2020 and $50 to $100 by 2030, provided a supportive policy environment is in place. So those are numbers that would not in any way destroy the economy as we know it. And I actually think it would actually provide a lot of stimulus for economic growth because firms would face the challenge of retrofitting their enterprises, households would too. And so it would actually spur both innovation and investment. And so would be what you call a win-win solution.
Jean Tirole, Nobel Prize of Economics, a few days ago, in an interview regarding his recent book, has been saying that, commenting on the idea of green growth with, let me open a parenthesis, it's part of the official agenda or initiative in many international institutions, the UNEP, and the European Union has also an agenda on circular economy in particular and green growth. But his comment was, well, if it would be possible, we would have already done it unless we are completely stupid. And so what would be your take? Why we have not done it yet?
Well, I have a great deal of respect to Jean Tirole, but nobody is perfect. And it is very reminiscent of the standard cartoon about the economist seeing a $50 bill on the ground and not bending down to pick it up because he says, if it was really there, somebody else would have picked it up. I mean, the fact is that what we study in economics is why markets sometimes don't work. And if we were in the best of all possible world, we would be unemployed. That might be the best for a lot of people, but we as economists would be unemployed. So the point I'm making is that the economy is rife with imperfections, and individuals are not perfectly rational. The Nobel Prize this year went to Richard Taylor, who's worked in behavioral economics, sort of highlighted the fact that there are systematic ways in which people are not fully rational. And the most important reason that we don't, at least one of the most important reasons why we aren't where we ought to be, is we don't price not only carbon, we don't price any of the other consequences of behaving in an unsustainable way. So when we think of the destruction to the environment, it has implications for water. It has implications, you know, we treat water as if it's a free good. We treat, almost every aspect of our environment as if they're free goods. And obviously, that's, you might say, a mispricing. We know water is scarce, climate, the atmosphere is scarce, and so markets don't work when there's a zero price associated with something that's scarce. So and this is not a little mistake in our economy. This is a very big mistake, and with a very big mistake like that, we get very bad outcomes.
One of the ways in which many people have been addressing this question is, and this is essentially also the result of the G20 task force on climate-related financial disclosure, is, well, the recipe is let's ask financial institutions to disclose more diligently their climate risks, and this will be essentially sufficient to tilt the market in the right direction. Do you think it's sufficient, or what do we need more?
Well, first, I think disclosure is important, not only of financial institutions, but also of corporate balance sheets. I mean, on the balance sheets of lots of corporations, there are assets that are very vulnerable to climate change. But it's necessary, but it's not sufficient, because all the reasons I just talked about, mispricing of carbon, mispricing of water, people do not have the right incentive either for economizing on the resources or innovating in the right direction.
So you seem to point to the fact that we need some kind of stable policy framework to guide this. But and then in this respect, as a former chief economist of the World Bank, how do you see the role of development banks in fostering the transition to the low-carbon economy?
Yeah, so let me emphasize, I talked about carbon prices, but the issue is far broader. So when we think of moving to a green economy, a low-carbon economy, we have to change the way we organize our cities, our transport systems. We have to change our mental frames, how we think about a lot of these issues. And much of what is going on is within the public sector. So how we organize a city is not a question of an individual, but it's zoning and how you organize a city, and that affects how much people spend on transport. And when you design, housing designs of buildings, building codes need to be sensitive again to, when you buy a house, you don't think about these issues, and building codes are really very, very important. Well, so what that says is that you need carbon pricing, but you need a lot more than that. You need a whole framework, a public framework for this. And this is where the development banks come in a very important way. When we move to emerging markets particularly, but I think there's a role for development banks even in the United States, there are large gaps in financing from the private sector. Some of these have to do with the fact that much of the private sector has a short-sighted focus, not the long-term focus. But there are a whole variety of reasons why development banks can play a very important role in climate finance. We still don't have the instruments for mitigating risk, some of the climate risk that we need in the private sector, and development banks have played an important role in mitigating some of those climate risks. And so overall, I think some of the important spurs for investments in climate investments around the world, in emerging markets, developing countries, have come from development banks. And the interesting is the two new development banks, the New Development Bank, which is the BRICS Bank, and the AIIB, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, both in their very founding, we're very concerned about climate change and promoting climate investments, and in also thinking about how they work with the private sector in developing new instruments to make sure that their limited amount of resources can be leveraged to maximize the impact on climate.
Thank you, Joe. So that leads me to a question to Ms. Duarte. So we had actually an entire session this morning on development banks and their action in sustainability, in sustainable finance, and in particular in climate finance. So I'd like to turn the question to Ms. Duarte. So you lead the Climate Investment Fund, and I think it would be very interesting for many people who are even from the financial sector, but they don't know so much the world of development finance. So what is the mission of the Climate Investment Fund? And if you could mention an example of how you deploy your mission.
Thank you, Stefano. You can treat me as my father. And thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be here. It's an honor to be with this panelists. I have a great esteem for Professor Stiglitz. And very good to be in Zurich, my first time in Zurich, so thank you very much. And it was good because Graham and Professor Stiglitz mentioned two things that I've actually underpinned the climate investment funds. One is political will and the importance of political will. And I will reflect a little bit on how that has played a role in terms of the climate investment funds and what we've achieved so far. And the other point is the role of public sector and public sector finance. So back in 2008, at the time of the global financial crisis, and at the time when the climate negotiations weren't going as many wanted them, or at the pace that many wanted them to progress, a group of champions, and therefore the political will, joined forces and established these funds. At the time, these were $5 billion with a specific mandate to de-risk and provide the incentives, the subsidies that would be necessary for governments, private sector institutions, commercial banks to make these investment choices. So instead of deciding to invest in fossil fuel types of power generation, to instead invest in renewable energy. And recall, I mean, this was quite an undertaking in 2008, 2009, 2010. But what we've demonstrated, and the way we do it, is through the development banks, through the multilateral development banks. Because it's very clear as well that when one is trying to operate in countries where there are no markets, no renewable energy markets or no energy efficiency markets, and we are trying to pilot and test approaches in developing countries, which is where we operate, development banks are a key partner and give confidence to the private sector investment, to the private sector investors and to the commercial banks to come along. And so this is exactly what has happened. We started off with around $5 billion. Now we are at $8 billion. We started with around 40 countries. Now we have 72 countries. And what we have done in many different countries, many different developing countries, is help commercial banks understand what a credit line for renewable energy or energy efficiency could look like, how they should structure it, how they should price it. We've worked, and this, by the way, both in renewable energy and energy efficiency, but also in climate resilience, which is an area that is equally important. We have played a role in de-risking geothermal power generation. Geothermal power generation is very risky upfront because while the resource isn't proven, it's very risky. Private sector won't come in. Governments will also shy away because of opportunity costs. And therefore, you know, this role of public money channeled through the multilateral development banks and bringing along other partners has basically played a key role and demonstrated the value of the public money that takes on risk, public money that lowers cost of capital, and the results are there. I mean, if we look at Morocco, South Africa, Mexico, Thailand, and we look at where they were in terms of renewable energy investments in 2008 and 2009, and with our risk concessional capital alongside with development banks, what role it played, and the comfort provided to, in particular, debt providers in these countries to come along and be part of the first structures and then start to provide this commercial debt to private sector investors that wanted to continue to pursue those investment opportunities. I mean, I can speak on different examples, but I want to stress this point of political will, and I want to stress the point on public sector and resource and scarce public sector resources playing a role in providing the incentives for investment choices and de-risking private sector flows.
I'd like to pick up on that last comment on the de-risking. So, in terms of economic theory, is the role of development banks, in particular the climate investment funds in this case, is it fixing a market failure or is it doing more? Is it creating markets somehow? In your mission, I've read that the CIF ventures...
I mean, as Professor Stiglitz says, there's a number of different market failures. So we do address, I mean, one example I was just giving, local commercial banks, they don't have the know-how. We've seen in many developing countries, they don't have the information, they don't have the know-how on how to structure credit lines for these type of investments, which haven't been done before in their own countries. And so, you know, what we do is, what's necessary, it's some sort of small grants to provide technical assistance to these commercial institutions. If what's necessary is concessional interest rates to begin with, to also provide incentives to, you know, the markets to uptake those credit lines. If what's necessary, it's a guarantee to, you know, potentially offset risks, that's what we provide. So, I mean, the other thing that I think it's important then in terms of public money, and why we've, you know, played, I believe, a key role in the last 10 years, is, you know, flexibility of the instruments, and being able to do things that, you know, the multilateral development banks by themselves can't do, because they also have to take into account risk. There are consequences to them on taking higher levels of risk as well. So I think, you know, when we talk about public money, I find it critical. I mean, we know what subsidies did for fossil fuels. And so at the time when people believed that was the right thing to do, but there are also nuances in terms of of public money. And we do need, once we want to, you know, drive markets, drive behavior change, drive institutions, policy change, we need the right type of public support and partnerships.
And in particular, take-home message that I get is the CIF is trying to crowd in the private sector by resolving the initial, you know, smoothing the barriers for them to get in. And so that leads me to Mr. Unger from Zurich Insurance. I actually read very recently, well, first of all, Zurich Insurance explains how climate is now integral part of the managing strategy, but recently I read on the Financial Times this announcement that Zurich Insurance will stop covering new coal mines. So the question to you would be, what's the business case for Zurich Insurance? How is this making sense in business terms, including climate into the managing strategy?
Thank you for that question, Stefano, and it's a great pleasure to be here as a representative of the private sector. You can read a bit here and there about Zurich Insurance, what we do around climate risk, what we do to be a sustainable business ourselves. Maybe I should just go one step back. It's more comprehensive than maybe the few headlines that you might read in the Financial Times. Our business is very fundamentally about taking risk. So insuring is taking risk off our clients, and investing is investing with risk. Government bonds and cash is not the only thing that we hold. And we need to make informed decisions about risk. Now, climate risk, as you mentioned in your opening remark, is one of the biggest risks for the planet, and it's massive, and it's in the long term. But the general recognition that it's that wasn't there 10 years ago. So we are now, from my point of view, at an interesting inflection or maybe acceleration point in the recognition of that risk. So the Paris Agreement showed that the ability of the world to come to some consensus about that being a risk is much greater than maybe previously feared, and now we can hope that we go forward on that. Now, when it comes to environmental risks, for instance, if I think about our corporate underwriters, so people who assess whether we can insure a given plant of an industrial company and under what conditions and on what price. These specialists have looked at environmental factors for the longest of times. You know, spillage, putting poison in the air, poisoning a river, the liability that comes with that, the cost of cleanup, etc. That's stuff that we insure, and that's stuff that we need to assess before we insure it to make sure it's the right price. We've also, for the longest time, had an element of that business which is called risk engineering, where we actually first advise the client about mitigation of those risks so we can accept it and get a better price. That can be safety, etc. Now, where is climate a bit different is in the newer recognition, and fundamentally it is, you know, people don't know and people don't know enough. So our underwriters are now asked to take these risks into consideration more and more. We have thousands of underwriters. Are they all in the right place in terms of education, models and training? By no means, but that is where we need to move on the liability side of our balance sheet. And then the asset side is the mirror image. Our stock analysts, whether we employ them or whether they're with an asset manager that gets a mandate from us, our stock analysts, our corporate bond analysts need to be able to think about, here's a utility bond, what happens to that utility if indeed a $100 carbon price is introduced next year, the year thereafter? Because my hope is it's unavoidable that it's going to happen, right? It's key for the world. But these corporate bond analysts most definitely had carbon pricing for utilities not on their radar 5 years ago. Now they need to get it on their radar. So that's the ESG integration. And so it's about risk management, sure, protecting downside, but it's also about picking the winners among the future stocks that the future winners among the stocks and bonds that we need to hold, and in order to protect our balance sheet. One more maybe thing about business case. So, you know, this conference is, I guess, is about finance, but it's also, I guess, Professor Stiglitz also mentioned, you know, the physical assets that exist, and the action needs to happen in both. And one physical asset that we own is property, is real estate, which we also refurbish. And it's for the longest of times been a good business case to take a property, you know, once in 20 years, you do the general refurbishment, you exchange the heating system, you exchange the window panes, you exchange the steering of the heating and so forth. So that is actually, I guess, reducing the environmental footprint of those properties. And we've done it for a long time. The business case would just be a whole lot stronger if carbon was priced at $100, because then, you know, these would be winners, not with, you know, I don't know, 10-year payback, but maybe with a 5-year payback until markets adjust. So there's a lot of things that we can do, and it's not, you know, not just one single measure.
Thank you. Time to turn to Mr. Steen. I have a similar question. ING and has a different business model. So I'd like to hear from you, why does it make sense from a business perspective to integrate sustainability in your business as ING has been doing since quite a long time now?
Thank you. Perhaps for the audience who are not all bankers, we might just begin with a very obvious statistic to me and possibly not to you. We run, indeed, a large portfolio of lending. That is how we provide the capital across, in my case, 40 different countries. I can afford to lose approximately €1 in each year for every 500 that I lend. It is therefore not open to me to be taking very large amounts of risk. I have to focus my funding on projects which are, in a large world, sustainable. Now, we have been dealing with risk management in the terms of avoiding things we should not do for many years. We're a large commodity bank. We do not want to be financing soybeans that have been grown on illegally cleared land in the Amazon. We have been a leading member of the Equator Principles, which deal with the management of environmental and social risk in project finance. But a number of years, and we are, a number of years ago, we stopped financing new coal-fired power stations and new coal mines, and we have recently announced that we will eliminate our business with any company that has more than 5% of coal in its business portfolio. We will do that by 2025. A few years ago, we addressed ourselves the question, all of this negative stuff is all very well. What is it that we can do to think about positive contributions towards addressing sustainability challenges in the world? And one of the themes that we felt that it was not enough to hire a few windmill finance experts and put them in a room with a green door and allow the rest of us to tick the box that said sustainability and get on with our business. What we have sought to do across the whole wholesale bank is to involve everyone. And what we feel and what we know is that actually, particularly the energy transition, but other sustainable issues, are very high on the agenda of the CEO of virtually every single one of our clients. And if they're not, then I'm not certain that we want them as our clients, because we believe that those companies that are most active about thinking how to adjust their businesses to the challenges of sustainability will be those in the long run that are able to repay our loans. So we believe that we will serve our various stakeholders a good deal better if we know what we are doing on sustainability. We believe it's in a case for our long-term profitability. Banks are, of course, creations of a compact with society. We need to ensure that we are supporting society in those changes. And the better that we understand the risks, rather like Zurich, there are risks in our loaned portfolio which will arise from the energy transition if carbon taxes, which I personally very strongly support and advocate as the answer to many of your questions later on, they will nevertheless be disruptive for some of the clients' business models. And we have to understand how that might happen. We do not know how the energy transition will play out. We do a lot of scenario planning to try to understand what the potential outcomes might be for our loan portfolio.
Thank you. I'd like to actually expand a little bit on this last three interventions. And I'd like to ask, how do you measure the progress of your institution and your portfolio towards sustainability, and in particular climate action? So we can do it in the start again from Mafalda, maybe. So at what stage within, because I imagine that this also takes organizational changes, you know, and so the question would be, at what stage that is of that process are you within the organization, and what does it take for others to follow your lead?
So it's been interesting because, you know, one of the strategic mandates of the climate investment funds was to drive change in the multilateral development banks themselves. And I mean, again, taking us back to 2008, what one can call these days climate portfolios didn't represent that much in their overall portfolios. Right now, they have made commitments of 28%. The World Bank has made commitments of 28% of their overall portfolio as climate-related by 2020. So that was one of the objectives, and we've actually done quite a bit of work, stimulating quite a bit of work among the multilateral development banks to begin with, and now with the multilateral development banks with other financial institutions, including the Development Bank of China and others, in terms of metrics. How do we assess progress? So let me just take an example of the energy sector. And you were asking at what points in time do we assess? So we do assess what are the expected results and the expected outcomes when we ourselves decide our investment choices and decisions. And so some of the metrics that we use is access to, well, energy access, how many people are actually going to benefit from access to energy services from renewable energy. Other things are the share of renewable energy in final energy, overall energy mix in the countries, or of course greenhouse gas emission reductions. And there has been quite a bit of work amongst the multilateral development banks to come up with common methodologies on GHG accounting, and they've achieved that for some sectors. They haven't achieved that for all of the sectors. So we do that upfront when we are looking at various investment choices and which ones to prioritize. And then, of course, for those of you who are not that familiar with the multilateral development banks, Professor Stiglitz is, you know, the multilateral development banks actually monitor these projects very closely and regularly. And so, you know, during the implementation of the projects, some of these metrics are assessed, and certainly after completion, to basically give us a sense of what was the deviation between what was expected and what was finally achieved, and that informs as well the retrofitting of the methodologies themselves and the metrics. So these are some of the ways through which we assess in terms of renewable energy. There are other metrics for the forestry sector, for climate resilience in different sectors, but these are some of the ways in terms of renewable energy.
Thank you. And I'd like to turn the same question, and just one reminder that the clock is over there ticking. Since, as was said, we can only act upon what we can measure, so I guess the question is, how do you measure the progress in your institution, and are your investors and stakeholders asking for that?
I'm sure we'll get back to the question of measurement, because it's one of the really tricky things around here. But to actually have action, you know, for a practitioner and for a public company, you know, with a real portfolio and not just good ideas, we need to pick a few things that we can do and that we can actually measure. So for Zurich, for instance, we have committed about 5 years ago to invest $1 billion in green bonds, and shortly thereafter, we escalated that commitment to $2 billion of green bonds, which makes us one of the larger owners of green bonds among global insurance companies. We hit the $2 billion target last year and now are at about $2.3 billion. That's just volume, and you can challenge me and say that's not good enough, because what about the CO2? Do you really know? Of course, when we buy green bonds, we ask for them to be really green. According to the principles, our analysts don't buy just any bond that calls itself green. At the same time, we just have to be maybe humble about the ability of truly measuring the CO2 impact and believing and then also adding up all of the numbers. So these are limitations. So in light of that limitation, let me commit to volume, and that's what we've done. And similarly elsewhere, right? I mean, our CO2 footprint as an operation, I can't measure it down to the last decimal, you know, as a trained scientist, maybe not that satisfactory, but in real life, we set ourselves a target in something that we can do. So our operating CO2 footprint, for instance, from our buildings, from our heating, from our corporate travel, we committed in 2007 to reduce by 50% by 2015, and we actually hit that a couple of years ago, by 2017, I think, and we hit that a couple of years ago already. So pick a few and commit and go for it.
May I expand a little on that? Zurich Insurance has lots of cooperations with the academia, and in particular also with the University of Zurich. So I'd like to know if you have any comment about how can academic research help making a better measurement of progress.
I'm not a trained economist, so maybe, but you know, maybe the biggest thing that we cannot do is I cannot look at my entire equities portfolio together with my entire corporate bond portfolio and assign some level of CO2 footprint to that. And maybe that's just too hard because, you know, we don't own these companies, but we lend to the companies, or maybe we invest in a fund that lends to the fund, or it's a CLO. There's all these complexities in flowing and following, you know, your area, I guess, tracking money. That's really hard. And if academia can help us, but also pension funds and other large institutions, what are good ideas to get to an aggregate picture in a complex portfolio, multiple geographies of how CO2 intense is this, and what should one measure, what should be disclosed, what can be done robustly, consistently, etc. That would be major progress.
Thank you.
Because then we can get a target on that.
I'd like to turn the same question to Mrs. Steen from ING.
Well, I agree with that. I mentioned our positive approach. At the outset, we had to create our own metrics. What we did was created a very simple test for pretty much every transaction, new transaction that came into the wholesale bank. It either gets a green leaf or it doesn't, and we measure our progress by reference to the total volume of transactions, which I think have got to about 34 billion in terms of loans to sustainable outperformers, in terms of what you would clearly recognize as project financings that are clearly sustainable. We can measure relative sustainability, but it's a perfectly decent measure for managing the business internally, but it's not, and of course we can disclose it, but we get constant questions. We've explored measuring the carbon footprint of our lending, but frankly the world's need to improve both transparency and standardization on metrics for carbon intensity. Trying to do it on our own by asking our clients, we've thought about it, we don't see it as a valid approach. And I think measurement is critically important, but necessary, but by no means sufficient. I think that much more so in getting the finance system to support a sustainable world is aligning it to the economic realities and ensure, you know, but we are intermediaries. We finance companies out there in the real economy. For so long as societies continue to depend, as to 80%, on hydrocarbons, there's not a great deal that our actions can do about that. And wherever you can create projects which can be financed by reference to that loss rate that I mentioned earlier, then we and others like us will finance them. We overcome the risks, the perceived risks, very rapidly. I can remember when we started with offshore wind, some of my colleagues in the Netherlands thought, you know, about what happens if they leave their bicycle at the seaside for a year. They come back and it's been deteriorated very significantly by the salt water. And so they said, you know, this thing's got to stand on a pillar in the middle of the North Sea for 20 years and still operate. How can that be? We have collectively come to a view with the industry in which those risks have been maintained so that we can support them. And if we, I am a very strong personal believer that carbon pricing would so transform the economics of all of the high carbon emitters that support the society in which all of us operate, that would be a very significant step in changing the thing. But measuring is important.
So you mentioned that measurement is not important, and sorry, the measure is not sufficient.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. And that led me to think about some episodes in which I've been talking to various type of actors, and it seems to be a little bit of an impasse, a sort of a vicious cycle where it's a kind of a stalemate, because on the one hand, you talk to politicians and policymakers and they say, well, it's not up to pick up, it's not up to us to move things, we're waiting for the market to do it. And then you talk to market players and say, well, it's not us, you know, we are intermediaries, we just, there has to be an economic policy. So,
yeah, but we've just heard one of the world's leading economic policy experts briefly explain about externalities not being costed in I mean, so long as that happens, entrepreneurs out there are not going to be producing the project finance proposals which are going to do the job, because the costs that they are facing and the you know, the world as it is works in a particular way, and we need to change the costs that people face.
So would you, as a message to also all the community working on sustainable finance, is it fair to say that it's important to keep in mind that, you know, sustainable finance is very important, but it cannot be a replacement for other type of things we need to do in the economy?
Well, I guess you might say I'm slightly challenging. I don't think sustainable finance, I don't think we need to completely reinvent the finance system. We simply need to create enough projects out there that are financeable, that do the job that we want them to do.
Thank you.
I mean, you know, what financeable means in terms is whether it's financeable depends on whether there's a carbon price, for instance, whether we've innovated in way of de-risking so that the risk has been allocated, taken out, and transferred to somebody who can absorb the risk and understands the risk. It entails having the complementary infrastructure that will work with it. So in a sense, any project and any financing of any project exists within a context, and they're operating in the context. Their job isn't to change the world, it's operating within that context. Now, they have an important responsibility to make sure that they're aware of, you know, that they're not making a mistake and not taking into account those aspects of it, and aware of, you might say, behavioral irrationalities, making sure that their staff isn't stuck not doing the right thing, and that's important, because we know that there are not only that there are all kinds of institutional rigidities within organizations and behavioral blinders, and those have to be changed. But there is really, you can't separate out the functioning of the private sector from the context that is provided by the public sector, including the development banks.
Let me turn a little bit on a more global scale. So we see that various international and national institutions are essentially including green growth in their agenda, and there's a number of commitments that have been made. We've seen the Paris Agreement, the SDGs in 2015, both in 2015, and this is seems a very encouraging development throughout the world. At the same time, we also see that there is there's a new form of discontent with the globalization. And the way in which some leaders in the world are dealing with this discontent and try to exploit it seems to be not exactly aligned with the 2 degrees pathway. So my question to you would be whether the transition to the low carbon could make globalization work better, and whether it could mitigate the inequality that is emerging from the new type of globalization?
Well, let me make just two comments. First, I think it is the international community will have to incentivize those recalcitrant countries. And now there's only two countries that haven't signed on to the Paris. United States and Syria, I think, are the two.
Even Syria signed.
Syria. So United States is now the single pariah country. And I believe I'm an economist, I believe in incentives, and the one incentive that you can provide is cross-border taxes. And I think it's absolutely essential. I've been arguing this since my book, Making Globalization Work, in 2006. And I argue there that it's actually consistent with WTO, which Trump wants to withdraw from anyway. But I think it's absolutely essential to have cross-border taxes. You can't, in a world of globalization, have free riders. But let me also say, globalization with green growth, with this enforced, incentivized participation by all countries is going to be advantageous to developing countries, poor countries, and including the poor, for a couple of reasons. First is, we know from the data, if you look at a world map, the people who are going to be most adversely affected by climate change are those in the poorest countries, the tropical belt, and those are all developing countries. But the second point is that there's a real opportunity. We used the word win-win earlier, that the retrofitting of the global economy for global warming, the new investments that it will be elicited by having a price of $80 or $100 a ton, those are going to be a very important stimulus to the global economy, and that increase in demand will create jobs throughout the world. And yes, there are going to be some industries, coal miners in the United States are going to have trouble, but there are already 5 times as many people working in renewable energy as coal miners. So, this is the nature of economic change. It is the responsibility of the government to help the people move out of the sectors into the new ones. But overall, this is, for the vast majority, a big win.
Thank you. I'd now like to turn up next question to Graham, but before that, I'd like to make you aware that we are collecting questions. You can submit questions at Slido. So could you please turn off the screen? So there will be a Q&A session, but I'd like you to warm up to that and have the time to submit a few more questions. I see already many there, but I'd like to give you a bit more time to submit still a few. And to particularly, since there are already so many, if you can rate the questions that are already there, that help me select the most relevant ones. So the next question I have, would it be in the short-term interest of the general public to support the transition to a green growth pathway? The reason I'm asking is because in your book you were emphasizing that for the feasibility of policy is important to design things that everybody sees as beneficial, even in the short term. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, you ask if it's in the interests of the majority of people to support green economics. I mean, one of the original titles we had for the book was "Your Grandchildren and How Not to Kill Them." Well, you asked before, Stefano, about the sort of tensions about perception and reality, and I felt a certain tension, I must say, for the last 45 minutes sitting here talking about carbon pricing or carbon bonds or green bonds or diversifying out of coal, and I just think this is so little from what is actually required. We think about climate change and we talk about 2 degrees, and we think, well, 2 degrees is nothing. But 2 degrees will actually take us back 10 million years in climatic history. And we'll start a process which will take us to 4 degrees, which will take us back 40 million years in climatic history. And not much can survive that. In about 3 or 4 years' time, we will make it inevitable that we will reach 1.5 degrees. It won't happen then, it'll happen about 10 years later. But in about 3 or 4 years' time, the amount of carbon in the atmosphere will reach the level that we will inevitably reach 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial times. And then all the world's coral reefs will die. By around 2035, we will reach a point which will make 2 degrees inevitable. It won't happen until about 2050, but we will be unable to stop it at that point. And when we reach 2 degrees, we reach 4 degrees. And all the world's ice will melt. It won't happen in anything like our lifetimes, but all the world's ice will melt, and the temperature will continue to rise for the next 500 years. We are at a critical point, and we have about 15 years to make some very big decisions. Now, when I hear things like carbon pricing or green bonds, it is nowhere near enough. We have to reduce the amount of carbon we put into the atmosphere by 9% a year if we're to meet the target. And even then, for the last 50 years of this century, we're going to have to suck carbon out of the atmosphere using technology we don't yet have and capture it. So we're at a very, very difficult point here, and we have to make some very big decisions. We have to shut the fossil industry. Shut it. We have to get out of the auto business, stop the transportation business. We have to find a way to change our economic systems to stop pumping carbon and methane into the atmosphere, or we're all toast. And that's the sort of decision we need to make. We need to stop pumping CO2 into the atmosphere, and we need to stop doing it now.
So then the next natural question would be, is the current representation mechanism of civil society appropriate to support this transition, given that it's something that should be in their interest?
Okay. For 45 years, the Club of Rome has tried to speak to politicians, the people that make decisions and the people that influence them, and we've failed, partly because politicians don't understand the risk, and partly because they're unable to make the decisions because the decision's a global decision. And so we've taken a new strategic direction in the last few years, which is try and speak to young people. We've started this project called Reclaim Economics to try and educate young people, to tell them that the economic system is what's killing them, that they need to fundamentally reform the economic structure, to stop focusing on growth, to start focusing on well-being, to redistribute wealth, not because it's simply a morally right thing to do, but because if you redistribute wealth, it makes it easier to have a transition. We can take all these people that work in the fossil industry and we can give them some sort of welfare payments during the transition where they retrain and do something else. It makes the transition to a low-carbon economy possible. So we need to change our economic system. We need a coalition of countries that get it. The European countries, the Germans, the Swiss, the Scandinavians, the countries that understand how urgent this problem is, and the Chinese. The Chinese get it. Xi Jinping gets it. And we need these countries to lead, and then we need a coalition of organizations like the Vatican, like the trade union movements, like the military, a strange coalition of groups that understand why we need to change the way we're running our economic systems today. We need a very strange grouping to come together to make this change. But young people are absolutely key to this. Make them understand that their future is at risk.
May I ask the other panelists to react on...
Maybe just one thing I can say to echo Graham Exton about talking to young people. You know, our job is to manage a company for profit for shareholders, and it's not even my company; it's shareholders' company. So that gives us certain things we can do. But one key thing that is business case for responsible investing and sustainable business practices is the engagement it generates with younger employees. And if I want to be attractive and hire, you know, smart young, kids off university, or sorry, young men and women off university, then I absolutely need to have a position in that. Now, Graham will challenge me and say, well, just positioning is not good enough and it's all marketing. But the things all have to come together, I think, and the generational change will help it. Maybe generational change on your timeline then says it's too late. I don't know. But it's necessary and it's helpful.
Any other reaction? And I can add up a question, which would be, given that there seemed to be somehow a political momentum, we've seen what happened in Paris in December, plus, so it's very mixed. On the one hand, we see what happens in the United States, but at the same time, all the large part of the states of the United States have been actually decided to asking the administration not to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. So we see it's heterogeneous. There's a lot of divide, and here in Europe, we see that many things are developing. So how do you see, how can I put it? Is there, do you see an interest in the financial industry in supporting this political momentum, both the public and the private financial industry?
Well, I said earlier, banks are creations of a compact with society. Of course, we have to operate to support the societies within which we work. But, you know, whilst I recognize and I share some of the anxiety that has been so eloquently expressed, you know, the question that we've all been discussing is what are the mechanisms that we can think of to allow us, as our societies, to effect the changes. Because, you know, my basic belief, and I think here I'm departing from being an ING Bank person but we get the politicians that we vote for. In the UK, if some politician informs you that he can improve the National Health Service by efficiency, you will vote for him rather than the one that tells you that he's going to put your taxes up to pay for it. I mean, that is there are core issues with democracies and the way that they work.
Why don't we start taking also some pictures, some questions from the... That's because I had the phone. There is this one that is highly rated. What is it? Yeah, to solve the problem of climate change, do we need a price for nature or do we need a new price theory? Who wants to pick that up?
So, what I was trying to suggest is that a necessary condition, and I think this is what is the price of carbon. So basically, you have to incentivize people in a, you know, we have a very decentralized economy. Every society is very decentralized, so we have no way of commanding people to do lots of things. But we do have lots of powers within government in terms of regulation. I mean, we can shut down coal-fired plants. So there are scopes for public policy to really change behavior in a fundamental way, just by certain. So in my view is we need price. We need prices to incentivize. We have to have. It would help at least to have new innovations, but we also have to have large role for regulatory authorities and we have to have development banks to sort of facilitate what's going on. There's one more aspect of this that I want to emphasize in terms of what Graham said, and that is our report was based on what the basic, you know, scientific evidence is today about what price would, with the kinds of other accompanying policies, would actually achieve the 1.5 to 2 degrees temperature. So the broad consensus within the academic research is that this would probably achieve what the goals were set forth in Paris. So there are two questions that leaves. One is, how do we deal with risk? That the climate models are imperfect. The models in physics have made it clear that there are some very large nonlinearities, positive feedback systems. And so those lead to some potential very large downside risks. And if you, depending on the weight that you give to those possibilities, that determines how aggressively you move forward on that within the next short-term period.
Thank you. Just on the question of pricing nature, there are a number of members of the Club of Rome. Bob Costanza, I think, is perhaps the best known, who developed this whole idea of natural capital and pricing nature. One of the great features of the Club of Rome is that we don't all share the same views. So he knows that I don't agree about this. But the danger of pricing nature is that you then commodify it. That to say that this piece of forest or this animal is worth so many millions of dollars is to mean that you can buy and sell it, that it's got a value. It's a bit like trying to value the love you have for your family. I mean, it doesn't make any sense at a certain point. And once we turn it into something to commodify, we end up risking it. So I much prefer what Joe's saying, which is to regulate. And just one other point. We talk about Paris. Let's just be clear. Paris, miracle as it was, is not enough. Paris will not achieve 2 degrees. It doesn't lead to any reduction in carbon until 2030, and we need to reduce it now. So Paris is great. It's a good place to begin, but it's not going to solve the problem.
Is there any further reaction from the other panelists? I'd like to pick up.
I just want to agree with Graham about the issue of the standard economics does have this very strong risk of commodifying lots of things. And so when the question is, do we need a new price theory or a new micro theory? I would say that one of the problems of standard economics is that it begins with a premise that you can effectively price everything. And we know that that's not true. Some of the most important things are things you can't price. And I think that narrow perspective has had large social costs.
Let me now turn to, there are so many questions. I mean, let's maybe pick the one on central banks. So there is a highly rated question on whether central banks should play a role in climate action.
I think that they already are. The Governor of the Bank of England made a widely read warning to the financial services industry, intermediaries, both in the insurance market and in the bank market, about saying that if you are not taking into account the prospects and the risks of the energy transition as a director of a company, you are not doing your job properly. Inevitably, in terms of bank regulation, there is a focus on the downside of the risk in our portfolios. There is a lot of questions about how we are thinking about responding to energy transition risks, but it's, as I say, it's mainly focused on the inevitably, perhaps, it's mainly focused on the downside.
Can I just add, we had a very good session this morning on precisely this issue, and there were some really good suggestions about stronger roles that the central bank could play. For instance, what kinds of collateral do they accept when they engage in central bank open market operations, and basically loans that are dirty are obviously ought to be not part of the transactions, but they can go further. They can say that they could give preference for green loans, and that would make green loans more attractive because they would be able to be traded, to be used for open market operations. So that's one example. There are lots of other things that ways that central banks, the Federal Reserve in the United States, can basically buy local bonds. It hasn't done it, but it's within its purview, rather than just buying federal bonds. But it could buy local green bonds to encourage infrastructure and all kinds of green activities. So the central banks have, in many countries, have been engaged in public policy. In the United States, again, we have CRA requirements, community reinvestment requirements that encourage lending to minorities. Well, that's an explicit statement that central banking is involved, our banking regulatory system wants to encourage certain things. Well, one of the things it ought to be doing now is encouraging this issue, which is existential for our society. And so it's been pretending that it's not, and it doesn't want to interfere with the market. But the market, we know, is distorted because there isn't a carbon price. So it ought to be taking a more active role in trying to shape the financial markets.
So let me pick this other question. What would be the one single policy that would best mobilize private finance into green? Oh, sorry. What would be the one single policy that would best mobilize private finance into green investments?
A global carbon tax. Well, we've said it before.
Okay.
But it's a necessary but not sufficient condition, right? There's other aspects of sustainability. Not everything can be priced, but maybe water should be priced. Maybe the utilization of the ocean for fisheries should be priced. Maybe there's ways to. There's a few of those while we're not pricing every single tree.
So maybe, my question would have been, should we stop thinking that there is one single policy that can solve everything, and it's a range of policies anyway? The world is maybe more complex than being dealt with one policy.
Yeah, I mean that was one of the conclusions of our commission. And let me just mention one example of a small policy that could have a very big effect. In the United States, and I think in some other countries, pension funds and other funds have fiduciary obligations which do not allow them to look at things like whether it's green investment. They're supposed to look only at the narrow returns. And that forbids them to take a more active stance. And we ought to say just the opposite, not taking into account the risk associated with dirty investments is a violation of your fiduciary responsibility. In the same way that Mark Carney made the big deal at the level of the central bank, the fact that that risk has been recognized in the central bank, but not for pension funds, I think doesn't make any sense.
I think that if I can just add to that, the fiduciary rule would be extraordinarily powerful because it affects so many players in the financial system, you know, including the management of stock companies, asset managers that have certain mandates, the pension funds in the US and so forth. And maybe the European Union could take a position on what they think in their very, very large economic area, what fiduciary rule should include.
Can I just pick up on this finance question? Because private finance clearly has a role to play, and private finance can play a very, very beneficial role. There's an awful lot of greenwashing going on right now, which isn't helpful, but there are certainly also impact investors who are willing to take a loss. But what we've got to remember is that with a lot of the transition that's needed, there's not a profit in that. This is for governments to manage the process of the transition. And so to me, if you want a policy recommendation, it's print money. You know, if we can print money to save the banking system, which is what we've been doing for the last 10 years with QE, let's print money and save the climate. All we can do is go bust, but at least we'll be here in 200 years. So print money.
So, on that note, let me open the floor to some questions, but with the deal that you are able to express your question in less than 20 seconds. So there was at the very bottom, the first one, but we need to borrow, yeah, one microphone over there. Thank you. Okay, let me indicate. Keep going, yeah. Then if you can. Okay.
Yeah, my name is Alec Gagne, and we were talking a lot about growth, green growth, there is qualitative growth, all these growth discussions. We have it was said by Mr. Graham Maxton that we should change radically this economic system. And we have a compulsion to GDP growth nowadays. And this compulsion, what is the cause of this compulsion to the GDP growth? That's the big question. Is it because money is created, the capital is created, but the interest, for example, is not created? Does it have to do with the central banks who can make quantitative easing, but this quantitative easing is going into the financial markets and not benefiting the people? So these are the questions what we should handle.
Let's collect maybe 2 or 3. So there was this lady here. No, one, yeah, and then afterwards is Carlo.
I'm Sophia Tikel. I'm asking, my question is about the context in which the conversation is happening, and I'd like the panel's views on how the rise of populism and also the change in how we communicate amongst ourselves with social media might actually influence. Where are the opportunities and the threats within the rise of populism and social media?
And Carlo, next row.
Carlo Jäger from the Global Climate Forum. I completely support the idea of the carbon price. I think it's good to have a number on it, to say we want to get $100 or euros, that doesn't really matter, stepwise of course, but put the figure there and work towards it. I think, however, there's a danger in treating this as not only necessary but sufficient. Just to give you an example, it translates for an increase of gasoline price in the order of 20 euro cents. That's worldwide an increase of 20%, America a bit more, Germany a bit less. We have been seeing much larger increases of gasoline prices. They have not given us a green car industry. So I would like the panel to say a bit more about additional and equally necessary measures without which we will just get a bit higher carbon price, like tobacco tax or something like that, tobacco tax or something like that, and that would not be sufficient.
One last for this round, over there, this lady.
So we spoke about carbon and financial social cost. So when you speak about political will to change, why don't we spend time on metrics to assess the benefits of sustainable initiatives for the long term?
Who would like to pick some of the answers?
Okay, so let me pick the GDP growth one, first of all, because the Club of Rome is most closely associated with that, and mostly wrongly, I should say. GDP growth, our focus on that has a fairly long history. If you look up the Mont Pelerin Society and its foundation in the late 1940s, a lot of the Chicago School, there was a concerted effort to push the idea of GDP growth and to feed it into our mindset, the way we think. With the loss of the Soviet Union, we lost a competitive system, and so it became what Antonio Gramsci would say, common sense. It becomes something that we just think is normal. And it's not. I mean, if I think about my grandparents' generation, they thought about playing golf or they didn't go shopping. They had different values. They thought about their families. So we have had this systematic approach which has forced us all into this mindset. Now, does GDP growth matter? I would argue it doesn't. If I put a zero on the end of every price of everything in Switzerland, the GDP will go up tenfold, but I won't increase the ecological footprint. And so the absolute value of GDP, I'm totally agnostic about. What we must do is stop using resources, and particularly stop using fossil resources. Then we can have whatever number we like for the GDP, and we can have as much growth as we like. But what we have to do is reduce the ecological footprint. And that means that we have to change the way we value nature and the way we value the goods and services that we buy.
Thank you. If you could share. I'm not an economist, and I'm pretty reluctant to attempt to, but it does seem to me that price mechanisms are, are actually very, very, very powerful. I mean, I had today in a beautiful restaurant in Zurich a very nice Swiss steak. I do not know what the price of that steak would be if its full carbon footprint, including the methane of the cows creating it, would be, but I suspect it would be quite a lot higher than it is today. And I can't possibly second guess the work of the Commission, but if people who think about these things come to a view, I don't think it's, and to go back to the earlier question, clearly carbon taxes are not a sole answer, but solution. But price mechanisms are incredibly powerful in the way of creating distributed mechanisms that people respond to.
Maybe on government energy policy, there's something big there that's explicit and that can be done, which is, I mean, the energy production, certainly in Europe, tends to be heavily regulated or partly government owned, and say the German government has taken very radical and kind of stepwise liberty at changing the composition of energy mix. Let's shut down all nuclear. Let's replace it with coal, sadly. So those actions have shown to be possible and highly influential. And the subsidies of the German government have had, while I'm much more free market, etc., the subsidies have had the impact of creating a very big and now independently profitable renewable energy industry in Germany. So there's a role there in the catalyzing and in the kickstarting for governments around the change in the energy mix. What's then very important is, I think, when governments and the private sector can combine to create more leverage. And so, sorry to come back on the green bonds that are so insufficient for your goals, Graham. But they were originated as, in a way, collaborative tools between the development banks and the private sector. We give leverage to development banks. It's either the World Bank or the IFC that invented green bonds about 7 or 8 years ago. And so if we do that smartly between governments and the private sector, we can just have a whole lot more capital in that. The behavior of the government, though, around, say, changes in energy mix has to be quite planned, with a good strategy behind it, clearly communicated, and commitments need to be upheld also by the government.
Just a second, let me announce it. So we'll please prepare for the last very short round of questions while, Joe, you want to have it?
Okay, just a quick answer to two of the questions. One, I think all of us have said over and over again that a carbon price is necessary, but not sufficient. And one of the things to remember is that currently governments are actually engaged in massive subsidization of fossil fuels. And that is one of the reasons why there's such utilization of fossil fuels. I mean, they've worked in the wrong way. And just getting rid of them would be a big achievement. But we really need to go, if we got rid of them and then went to a carbon price, I do think all the evidence is that it would have a very big effect, but not enough. I mean, I want to say it's not enough. It's necessary, but not enough. And that's where all kinds of regulatory aspects we've talked about. One of the things that, just to repeat, that the advances in behavioral economics have made us very aware that there are many instances where there are you might call them cognitive impairments, that people don't fully take into account all the consequences of their actions, and that don't take fully into account all the consequences of their actions, and that government, for instance, in the United States, the CAFE regulations, which were the regulations about fuel efficiency, the evidence is that they actually did work, and that to have achieved those through a price mechanism probably would have required unacceptably high charges. So there are cases where there are behavioral impediments that we have to take into account. And then final question about GDP. GDP is a very imperfect measure. But it clearly affects how people think. When I was chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, I tried to get us to convert to a green GDP, which would adjust the GDP for carbon, that would adjust the GDP for environmental deterioration and degradation and resource depletion. And one of the interesting responses was that Congress, the coal states, said that if you continue agitating over this, they were going to zero out our budget. So providing us some incentive to be somewhat less forceful in our agitation. But the point of the story is not that the coal states are an impediment, which we know, but the point is, why did they oppose it? They opposed it because they knew if we went to a green GDP, it would have an effect on how we think about policy, that it would mean that we would be more thoughtful about the kinds of trade-offs that we faced. And so that's really the important point, that we need to get better metrics that take into account the environmental effects of what we do. And those are just one of the deficiencies in the metrics. But in the last 15 years, there have been significant advances in the development of better metrics. We're not there, but there have been advances. And in many countries, there is a use of what I call satellite accounts, that the GDP is used, but there are also other accounts that are used to try to take into account some of these other aspects that I've just mentioned.
Thank you, Joe. That actually was working very well as a sort of final statement on your side, I suppose. So I'm afraid there is no time for the question, but there will be time to meet the speakers during the flying dinner will be open in a couple of minutes downstairs at the ground floor in Lichthof. But I'd like to invite the speakers to say a final statement, if you can be short as you can, of what you would like to deliver as a take-home message about the theme, how to close the gaps between finance and sustainability.
Maybe I start. I was paying very close attention to the debate. I do agree with Graham that there seems to be a bit of dissonance in terms of what we know from the science and what we see in terms of behaviors in general and in terms of policy measures. And a bit of we really have to realize, and if we pay attention to the science, we don't have a lot of time. And it's becoming very evident, every single year that we don't have a lot of time. And what it will take is fundamental shifts in the way we think about our economies and development and well-being. And so, but I am a believer in policy. And I am a believer in the role of a variety of public policies, carbon pricing being one of them, but other things as well. And it's proven. When governments come up with targets for renewable energy, when they come up with subsidies, when they come up, I mean, if they would mandate pension funds, institutional investors to do certain things, there would be a reaction. And that's the sort of reaction we need, and we need it from the various sectors. There was an interesting point as well. I thought one of the questions was on communication. And I do think that, and the rise of populism, I do think we ought to think about this point as well, and how we use communication in different ways from what we've done in the past, because it has clearly not been working sufficiently to get people mobilized and also demand from the governments the types of policies that we need them to act on and act them quickly.
Thank you.
I look forward to being overwhelmed by well-founded proposals that I can put money, I can lend money in to, my capital is very cheap. No, I'm not joking. I mean, you know, there's a spectrum of sources of capital. I've said a couple of times, you know, banks benefit from a compact with society. We transform your short-term savings that you want immediate access to into long-term loans. And in order to do that, we need to rely upon you, the central bank, in order to step in when there are bank panics. And in order to do that, we have to accept regulation. And the regulators, as has been said, may invite us. I mean, I am not a great believer in directed investment. What I am a great believer in is in creating the environment in which entrepreneurs and others come up with viable projects that are able to support proper lending in the medium term. But it's not all, you know, it's not all that easy. Just let us reflect upon the fact that electricity in most countries is a very politically important price. And when governments are tempted to retrospectively change feed-in tariffs to the disadvantage of those who have previously invested in renewable energies, it doesn't do any good for the enthusiasm for investors for sustainability investment. So let's avoid policy mistakes. Let's make policies that create spontaneous movement, and let's get on with it.
Mr. Anker?
Climate change is just an enormous challenge for the entire planet, and we've talked about lots of actors. They all need to do their part, the governments, the development banks, individuals, finance, utilities, citizens, social media, and so forth. It can only work in combination, and only that will give it the scale. Let's use economic forces where we can. Let's use incentives where we can. Those are really powerful. And then within all of that, you know, I'm prepared to commit my piece and the piece for Zurich Insurance Group to also contribute to solving that challenge.
Thank you. Graham?
When I studied economics, there were two key rules I remember. One, to remember that resources are scarce, and we don't think like that now. And secondly, to try and achieve Pareto optimum, to try and get the best possible outcome for the greatest number of people. So to think about welfare. And we don't do that anymore. So to me, we need reform of the economic system, and I don't think that's terribly difficult. But more than that, we need to rethink the role of the state. For the last 30 years, we thought that the state should be minimized. But we can't address the problems that we face through the market. So we need to have a strong state, and we need to think much more carefully about the role of the state and how to have good people in government.
And on that note, well, I'd like to thank all the speakers. We also have a little present from Zurich. I'd like to invite you to join me to give a big applause to our speakers for their excellent talk. So Just a moment. So there will be the possibility to collect and to have, if you want autographs, there will be 2 tables prepared downstairs in the Lichthof. However, one important thing, please, a bit of attention. So there are some representatives from the press in the room. If you have registered, and please, you need to please confirm that you're interested in the press conference. The press conference will take place in the room adjacent to this, to the on your right. Please contact Daniel over there. And for the others, you will have to wait about 20 minutes before all of our speakers are actually reaching or joining you down at the flying dinner. I'd like to thank you again, everybody, and I'll see you downstairs.